So I was happy to accept this invitation, specifically because of the theme radicality, and I took it as an opportunity to self-reflect about this notion with regards to the work that we've been doing at ROTOR over the past few years. Of course, this notion of radicality is a very open one and can be understood in many different ways. So my way to start this exercise is to just put a few anecdotes on the table, like specific stories, and then see how we can take it further. Of course, there is a sort of an underlying question, or uh, well, this wasn't made explicit by the organizers, but for me, the underlying question is one of morality. In what way can a design practice today be organized around a moral agenda, and what should that agenda be? So, my first anecdote, or the main anecdote actually, is is one that can be found in the Guardian newspaper of September 7th of this year. And the summary reads as follows. Last year, 3 cryptocurrency enthusiasts bought a cruise ship. They named it the Satoshi and dreamed of starting a floating libertarian utopia. It didn't work out. It is a fascinating tale of a few people who buy a cruise ship with the idea of setting up an independent society, the idea of seasteading. So I'll just read a few excerpts from the article. Why, he asked, in one of the most advanced countries in the world, were they still using systems of government from 1787? If you drove a car from 1787, it would be a horse, he pointed out. Government, he believed, needed an upgrade, like a software update for a phone. Let's think of government as an industry where countries are firms and citizens are customers, he declared. A bit further in the article, the difficulty in starting a new form of government, said Freeman, was simply a lack of space. All of the land on Earth was taken. What they needed was a new frontier, and that frontier was the ocean. Let 1,000 nations bloom on the high sea, he proclaimed with Maoist zeal. A bit further. In October 2020, it seemed his dream might finally come true when 3 seasteading enthusiasts bought a 245-meter-long cruise ship called the Pacific Dawn. They planned to sail the ship to Panama, where they were based, and park it permanently off the coastline as the centerpiece of a new society trading only in cryptocurrencies. But converting a cruise ship into a new society proved more challenging than envisioned. The high seas, while appearing borderless and free, are in fact some of the most tightly regulated spaces on Earth. So that is the end of the citation. And the article does not go deeper in the types of regulation and constraints that govern these seemingly unregulated spaces. So I'll just try to make an attempt to grossly divide them in a few categories. So a first set of constraints comes from any and all interactions that this enclave will have with the rest of the world. Do you want an internet connection? You're going to have to adhere to some rules in order to connect. Do you want to trade with other people? Same. Do you want insurance? Even more constraints, and so on. So the regulation is not a result of where you are on the planet. It is a result of the relationships you built with the rest of the planet. Secondly, there is a set of constraints that are not enforced by others, but are simply required by the situation you put yourself into. And the cruise ship is quite a dramatic example. If you pack a few thousand people on a cruise ship, you're going to need rules for almost everything. Obviously, there is, for instance, a need for some rules with regards to pets, to cooking in the cabins, to electricity usage, and so on. So what ended up happening with this cruise ship is that it became a sort of a dystopia of bureaucracy, where the initial idea was one of a free liberal society. So the sobering conclusion of this experiment, the way I see it, is that there is little point in trying to establish one outside in trying to start over. The constraints of doing so by far outweigh perceived advantages of cutting so-called red tape. So we are doomed, we are condemned at working inside of society to provoke changes. This is, I think, a good moment to introduce the work that we do at ROTOR Deconstruction. It attempts almost the exact opposite of seasteading. It does not look for a new virgin place to start over, but instead tries to build upon and make use of what is already there. In a physical way, of course, materials and reuse, but also the entire social and legislative and technical and so on layer that is on top of that. We accept the constraints, we negotiate them, we try to influence them, we try to change them. So ROTOR is a spin-off, as it was said before, of what is for the rest quite a classical design and research office. It was spun off about 8 years ago. The whole now is about 35 to 40 people, with ROTOR DC employing almost a third of that. So ROTOR DC is a separate company. So we are located in Brussels. It's like a daily business. We deal with clients, we sell materials. What is particular about the materials that we sell is that these are salvaged off demolition sites in and around Brussels. We operate, let's say, between Paris and Amsterdam. That's sort of the geographic area that we are most active in, but with 70–80% of our materials coming from within a 25-kilometer radius. Those are approximate numbers, just to give you an idea. The difference between reuse and recycling is that the idea of what we do is to use the material for its initial purpose, something that is quite close to its initial purpose, whereas in recycling there is this step to go back to raw material. The concrete is broken into smaller pieces, becomes aggregate, and can perhaps be used as aggregate again. We want to organize reuse at the scale of the material, or preferably even at the scale of a building component. So just one example of how this works in practice. This is the Parliament building of the Flemish community in Brussels. After 17–18 years of use, this building was totally demolished. We demounted the stairs of this building and sold them to a client that was roughly 3 or 4 kilometers away from the demolition site, depending on what road you take. So it allows for very local, very direct forms of economy that are quite close to carbon neutrality. So my job day to day is to go to demolition sites, to buildings, and sort of make inventories, make assessments of what the components in these buildings are that are worth salvaging and that can be reused. A lot of what we do is in office buildings, because these are the biggest volumes of materials that are being put on the market. We are different from like most other traders in the sense that we mostly trade in let's say modern building materials. So let's say the 20s, 30s, and afterwards, all up to sort of like very contemporary things. The question, of course, that we are confronted with on a daily basis is what does reusable mean? When we go into a building and we make an assessment of what materials can be reused, there's a whole bunch of parameters that come into place. For instance, if you are going to salvage a toilet, toilets used used to use a lot more water to flush than today. So is it still technically relevant to reuse an old fitting? Some materials, well, most materials actually are, of course, entirely too cheap to salvage because the labor cost is quite high. There is questions of demountability. There's also questions of toxicity, sometimes unexpected. For instance, the tiles that you see here, well, part of the tiles that you see in this picture are glazed using a radioactive pigment, and so once you know that, you probably don't feel like putting them back on the market again. So it's like a very broad spectrum of questions that of sub questions that we need to answer in order to assess if something is reusable. So in short, the economic answer to that is that a reusable material is a material that can be and processed for a cost that is below market value and leaves a little margin to assume for the risk. And you would be surprised how little materials actually can fit in this in this category. I would say that you know, I mean, a lot of our colleagues think that this is a bit of a definition, in the sense that a lot more materials could be considered reusable from a technical point of view. Engineers tend to think that if something is demountable, it can be reused, and so there's this whole field of design for deconstruction where this technical criterion is really used as a sort of a benchmark. Our answer to that is you can make exceptions from time to time. You can work below the actual cost of the whole process, but you cannot do so in a systematic way. So we adopt this almost as a sort of a polemical way. This is the basic gravity of our business. You can escape momentarily from it, but not permanently. And so we have this this thing in our company that we call the concrete paver check. And the concrete paver check is like a very simple exercise. Imagine you have an alley or a parking lot that is paved with these very typical concrete pavers. They require no mortar. They are simply put in sand, and so they're quite easy to salvage. Now, imagine that you hire a worker during one day, and you count the number of pavers that this worker can palletize. Then you compare the new market price of these pavers with the salary that it has costed to hire this worker to palletize the pavers, and this creates a sort of an index. In Belgium, it would be twice as expensive to have somebody manually pick up pavers and putting them on a pallet than ordering new. And this is, of course, because concrete is a super cheap material that is quite heavy, and so the automatization processes in the industry make it a very, very economical material to produce. So in other countries, there might be a different sort of, well, in other contexts, there are different ways of, sorry, let me rephrase that. Here in Belgium, we have to work in a reality where labor is super expensive and materials are super cheap, and so that means that we're on the wrong side of this check. If you go to certain parts of Africa and maybe in the far east of Europe, or maybe in Asia, there are places where this would be the opposite, but not in most of Western Europe economies. And so this brings us to some sort of, let's say, an uncomfortable situation, in the sense that we are being seen as a pioneering company in the so-called circular economy. Circular economy meaning a form of an imagined form of economy in which materials would be endlessly reused, recycled without any loss of quality. And this idea of circular economy is, of course, very high on the political agenda, because it would overnight miraculously solve all of our environmental and a lot of our economic problems. So ROTOR DC, being active in Brussels, being very visible as a pioneering company, we are often seen as a sort of a poster boy. And so we get a lot of private demolishers that want to work with us. And so we become this sort of a hot sauce, a little recipe that we add on to very classical projects, some sort of a little extra step that costs almost nothing more in the demolition phase, just to keep the status quo. And this is a danger that we are, this is something we fear a lot. And so, on the other hand, if we would want to be more radical, what I'm showing you here is an image of a Russian miner named Stakhanov, who famously held the record for the most coal a single worker has ever extracted in the Soviet Union in one day. And so Stakhanov is seen as a sort of an overachiever, somebody that makes everybody else feels as if they're not they're not quite as good as they should be. And so there is this tendency, I think, in the more radical that we are, the more things that we do that are economically suicidal, the more we risk having a sort of an effect on others, a discouraging effect. The current condition is that our economy is absolutely not set up to promote any form of circular or reuse economy. That being said, we do exist, and there are materials that can be salvaged economically. We have a 4,000 square meter warehouse in the center of Brussels. We buy and sell materials on a daily basis, and so it's tempting to fall into this trap where you say, well, we're not as radical or as we would want to be, but without us it would be even worse. And I think in architecture, and I say this with all the sympathy for the profession and its practitioners, but it's quite a common fallacy to fall into this reasoning. A lot of architects criticizing some of the projects that they are involved with, the answer tends to be, well, you should have seen the plan before we arrived. You should have seen the building program before we removed the 20% and so on. So without us, it would be worse. And I guess, yes, we circulate a few hundred tons of materials in Brussels, and those are materials that are not going to waste, and they do replace materials that would have been produced new otherwise. And so there is some truth to it, but I find if we stop there, it's kind of like a disappointing situation. There's a little form of sadness, the hero fighting an impossible battle, and we cannot give up, because then it becomes even worse. But we already know we can never win, whatever that means. I guess so. What we are trying to do, and it's a difficult line to fall into. Let me start in another way. Like, if we look at the imaginary, the visual culture of sustainability and the circular economy, it is quite disappointing. There is a sort of a sadness to the lack of imagination that these required transitions can accommodate. The the trash truck now has a recycling logo on it, but it's still more or less the same. It's still the same stupid little villa on the outskirts. Now it has solar panels on top of it. It's still the same lawn, but now you have to cut it less, and it consumes less of your tap water. It's still sort of like the same divide between the rich and the poor, the haves and the haves not, except now they are driving an electrical Tesla and maybe no longer a Cadillac. In architecture, it's a matter of sealing your buildings, of putting more layers of glass, and so on. And I think the Dutch Post in 2009 did a great job summing up the sort of the imagination of what sustainability is going to entail. And I guess in architecture, it's just a matter of how many layers of insulation you can put in and around one building, and that's about it. And this lack of imagination, or this lack of imagery, or this let's say this need for opening up possibilities in design is quite urgent and quite necessary. I feel that without that, it's very hard to be in a discussion, because otherwise you're always going to be in a sort of there is no alternative argumentation. And at the start of ROTOR DC about 9 years ago, we saw this piece by Rimini Protocol, which was very interesting. So this is a group that brings citizens, they call them experts, to the stage, and these experts, they act themselves. And so this was a stage where they brought a number of Lagos business people to Europe, and the performance was at the same time a theater piece, at the same time a way for these business people to pitch their company and their business to the rest of the audience. And so in a way, DC is set up as a performance. We used to joke that after a few years we would buy or rent Teslas and drive around in them, and sort of people would say, like, look, this salvage business really seems to be something. Look how nice the shoes they are that they are, and how big the cars that they are driving. And our initial idea was actually to give up after that, to just win a bunch of awards, and make this a sort of a play of some kind, and then other people would take over. Of course, this is not how it happened, but this idea of starting to create imaginary, to create a visual culture, a sort of a design language of what is possible, or other possibilities, is still very high on our agenda. And so you could say that instead of measuring our carbon impact in metric tons, or in negative metric tons, you could count the number of likes on our Instagram page, or the number of times that politicians in faraway countries cite our company as an example, or as something to follow. We sort of tried to bring to the table a positive imagination of how a different type of economy could work. And so what we do a lot of the time is not to put forward our own design, but is to put forward people that we think do interesting stuff with the materials that we sell. For instance, a small Brussels company that they bought a few panels in our shop and made this mobile closet for one of their clients, a very small project, a very small agency, but we sort of help them by showing images of their work on our Instagram. We sort of help them finding new clients and spreading a sort of enthusiasm around this form of material transfer. And behind that, of course, there is like an almost endless need for reinventions. Like what you see here is a drawing that shows our well, one step in our tile cleaning facility. So we built a machinery using vinegar baths, so tiles in order to remove the mortar when they are being demounted. They go 1 week in this bath of acid that totally eats up the mortar, and it's just one example of a sort of a hidden a hidden technical innovation. But a lot of innovation also goes in the sort of the contracts that we have with the demolition contractors, the legislation that we help to lobby for, and so on and so on. But I would say that if we yeah, this is about the moment where I try to round up, and you will see that it is a difficult exercise for me to answer our project is as ethical. And I would say in a way, in a very strong way, it is not. We accept the economic parameters of this city as a given. We operate within legislation. We try to provide what the market requires, meaning that we mostly tailor to, let's say, a bourgeois set of clients with a comfortable surplus income. And so in all those ways, we are almost anti-radical. You know, it is not an activist project. We are not using our unemployment fees to finance this whole thing. Absolutely not. And in fact, because our margins are so tight, probably we are even more conscious about this economy than, let's say, a company that generates a lot of margin. But within this non-radicality, within this absence to get outside of society, to create a sort of an alternative to I think there is a sort of a form of, if not radicality, a form of stubbornness that I would like to defend. And I think that these, I think a number of projects that we would probably associate spontaneously as being more radical, sort of like direct action, sabotage, anti-economic activities, and so on. They are absolutely necessary, and we sympathize greatly with them. But we are approaching the question from a different perspective. We're trying to enthusiasm, to imagine, to make a sort of a transition desirable. I'm very happy that now we have like 10 minutes of questions, because as you understand, these are for me still very much unresolved questions. Thank you very much.